So earlier this week, we highlighted efforts by the Biden administration to loosen federal restrictions on marijuana. All right, and I talked about that because I think it's a trend. We've seen states, we're upwards of about 30 states or so that have decriminalized marijuana. And then yesterday, California State Assembly advanced a bill that, if passed, it's already gone through the Senate. As it moves forward, and I'm sure the governor will sign it. Would make the Golden State the third in the U.S. to decriminalize psychedelic drugs for personal use. Now, are these and other Schedule I drugs riding on the coattails of marijuana? I mean, what value? Now, we're told that, in fact, if you listen to the rhetoric surrounding this, it's about our heroes. It's about treating post-traumatic stress syndrome. In fact, there was even money put into the most recent National Defense Authorization Act to fund studies on the use of psychedelic drugs to treat post-traumatic stress syndrome. But what is really underneath all of this? I mean, how should we view this from a biblical perspective? Is there a spiritual side to this? It's interesting that even those who are advocating for this says, well, this enables people to have a spiritual experience. What kind of spiritual experience? Well, with me now to discuss this further, Dr. Jennifer Bauwens, the director of the Center for Family Studies here at the Family Research Council. Dr. Bauwens has extensive clinical and research experience working with survivors of trauma and abuse, and has also taught on psychological trauma and research methods in several graduate programs. Dr. Bauwens, welcome back to Washington Watch. Always great to have you on the program. All right, I think you're muted. Let me hear you again. All right, I'm hearing you. All right, let's start with this. Can you share with us what drugs we're talking about when we use the term psychedelics? All right. We are having a technical issue here. Let's see if we can't work out the sound. Let me see. Can you hear me now, Jennifer?
Okay.
All right.
Can you
we
hear me?
are connected.
Okay. Yes, this is great. So when we're talking about psychedelic drugs, we're talking about a class of drugs that's also referred to as hallucinogens. And these have been on a Schedule I since the Nixon administration. So we're talking about a lot of years that these drugs have been noted as having absolutely no medicinal purposes. And actually, Schedule I also notes that these drugs are harmful. And so what we're seeing right now, which is a real push to not only remove them from the Schedule I, but to decriminalize them, as you said in your opening remarks. I'd just like to add a couple of things here that I think are important for our discussion, and that is when you look at the root word of psychedelic, which means to manifest the mind or manifest the soul. Other researchers will refer to these drugs, this class of drugs, as entheogens, and which refers to the divine within. So right off the bat, we're talking about a class of drugs that are aimed at opening up the mind, opening up the person's spirit to other experiences. So that tells us right off the bat, we're not talking about your normal class of drugs, your Aleve or Tylenol. We're talking about an experience that's meant to take us into an alternative world, if you will.
Well, and you've actually done study on this because you've raised alarm on this for years. This is not something that all of a sudden you said, hey, this is a problem. This is something you've been looking at for quite some time.
Yes, as someone who's been a part of the study of trauma, I've watched for years as these drugs have been promoted through the psychological community. And I think actually it's a sad case study, but it is an interesting case study in how our society gets primed to receive certain ideas that actually go against our value system. Because I think if you kind of go back a few years, most of us still have those images in our minds of the hippie generation. And, if it weren't for the Jesus people movement, that where people came to Jesus, who came to faith in droves, um, we wouldn't have a lot of value for the 60s. We'd think it was just like a real hot mess. But actually, those images were important for our sort of collective consciousness because they helped keep us from harmful drugs. So those proponents who from the 60s who didn't come to faith, who have been pushing these drugs and the use of these drugs in mainstream society, knew that they needed to change those images that most of us have of the dancing hippies. And so, as some political analysts say, we need to teach people how to ask for what we want to give them, what we want to feed them. So they knew that they needed to go back and find ways to make psychedelic drugs uh, palatable to us. And how do you do that? Well, you use the scientific community to harness your ideas, and you push them as respectable through the clinical fields, through the medical fields, and you build them as breakthrough therapies. So am I surprised that we're seeing this legalization push in the midst of the rise of saying, hey, this is helpful for PTSD, this is helpful for resistant depression, etc.? Of course not. They're not wasting the crisis to move forward with a legalization pathway.
I want to read a quote from the actual author of this bill, California Senator Scott Wiener, who is actually he's someone I've talked about a lot because if there's a bad bill in California, his name is on it. He's probably the worst in California. He said this, said, quote, and this is as he passed the bill out of the Senate, had the war on drugs not started in the 60s and 70s, we would probably be in a dramatically more advanced state around psychedelics. But the war on drugs, which criminalized possession and use, among other things, shut down everything, and we lost 40 or 50 years as a result. We're trying to reverse some of that damage. Is that not a rewrite of history?
I would say that's a pretty big rewrite of history. And that's what some of the political analysts would say is your tactic, is just keep repeating over and over again what you want the public to believe, right? So you keep saying, these are breakthrough treatments, etc. But the reality is that there are a lot of harmful properties to these drugs. Some people, one study said that 39% of those who used, what most of us would know as magic mushrooms, right? For those folks who have used those magic mushrooms, 39% said it was one of the top 5 worst experiences of their life. Some of the other people who are involved in these studies have already had previous experience with psychedelic drugs, so you're not parsing out the placebo effect. It is rewriting history, and it's using the scientific method once again to weaponize a narrative so that to get what certain politicians and proponents of these drugs are after, and that is we can't be blind to this. It is legalization. They want it just like marijuana,
Right.
to be available in every state.
So Dr. Bauwens, let me go back to a point that you mentioned. I mentioned at the beginning, the advocates of this, while not pursuing religious experiences, mention that this is a part of allowing people to have religious experiences, and this is what they're saying, and so I think we have to address that. There is a religious experience, but it's not in the sense that we understand religion in terms of what is good. You have some anecdotal experience with that, with individuals that you've talked to that have been exposed to these psychedelic drugs.
Yeah, and I wrote about this. You can find it on our website. There's a woman who was a part of some of the early clinical drug trials with LSD, and which is one of the drugs that's being decriminalized right now. And her experience was absolutely horrendous. It was a blind study, so she didn't realize what she was taking. She didn't have any preconceived ideas about the drug itself. But what happened is, as she was taking this dose, she continued to have persistent hallucinations, which is one of the side effects of these drugs, by the way. The side effects have not been well studied. All we're hearing about are the glory stories, so to speak, and we're not hearing the negative things reported, which, by the way, that should always be a red flag, because there should always be some kind of negative result. I mean, it's very rare to have a research body that, especially in the social sciences, that never has a contrary um, report. But that aside, so this woman, her experiences opened her up into the spiritual realm. Now, I realize for a lot of people that might sound a bit woo-woo or strange, but there is a spiritual reality that we are dealing with. And that is the purpose of a lot of these drugs. In many cultures, many different religions use them to access the spirit realm.
As
Now,
Christian
even in the Bible.
as Bible believing Christians and looking to Scripture, this would be opening people up to demonic activity.
Yeah, that's right. And so many places when you're reading the Bible and you see the word witchcraft, or you see, for example, Moses's encounter with the magicians in Egypt. Those magicians were not just partaking in witchcraft activities to access the evil realm, but they were also doing it with drugs that we would know as psychedelic or hallucinogenic drugs. And because they were using that to purposely to access the spirit realm. Um, these drugs are not something to play with. They are very spiritual in nature.
It's just very interesting that the timing of all of this, as we see a rise of lawlessness, we see increased demonic activity, that we see governments wanting to legalize more and more drugs that, as you said, and as the experts say, open people up to this religious, spiritual experience, but it's not good. Dr. Jennifer Bauwens, I want to thank you for joining us, and I'm sure that given what's happening here, this development, we're going to be talking about this a lot more.
Yes, I'm afraid so.